Well, welcome to our newest psychological health talk. We're going to be talking today about the mind-body interaction. So there are some things that when you're in a therapeutic situation, meeting with a clinician, you're not likely to touch on directly, but it's background information that's actually quite important in how the whole process works. And today we're going to talk about one of those pieces of background information that frames how our health works and hopefully helps us to be able to expand the way that we consider how things work. So in order to get there, in order to start that framing, I'm going to take you back to the first half of the 16th century. Now, during this time, one of the things that was going on historically in Europe was that there was the rise of what we now call the Enlightenment. And part of that was that there was a growing scientific community wanting to study in a scientific way how the world works, how the human being works, how the natural world interacts. This had been going on to some degree or other, but it really started to crystallize in the 16th century. Now, one of the problems they had was that the organization of society was built around religious institutions. And religious institutions were fine with understanding science for, how nature works, kind of getting the rhythm for what the length of sunlight is at different times of the year, all of those kinds of observations. But there was a sticking point when studying human beings. And so from a religious point of view, human beings were unique in the natural world and apart from other kinds of species. And this became a problem for scientists who wanted to study the human being as well as other species. So in an effort to try to create a compromise, there was an individual by the name of René Descartes. René Descartes is famous for a number of things. He was the person that coined the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," but he really also was interested in trying to solve this problem for how it would be that science could study the human person without stepping on the toes of science, or without stepping on the toes of religion, excuse me. So the proposal that he came up with is to say that thinking is immaterial and it's part of the soul and therefore belongs to the investigations of religious organizations, their understanding of the Bible, their understanding of theology. The human body, however, is a material being and therefore is part of the natural world. And because the human body is born, exists for a while, and dies, that isn't necessarily subject to the same inquiries of a religious scholar who's interested in the eternal, and in particular in the eternal soul. So his contention was that thinking is a part of the soul at the time, and it interacts with the body, but it isn't the same thing. And so he created what later on began to be known as the mind-body split. Now, he indicated, it turns out not to be true, but it was the best guess at the time, that the interaction took place in a small organ at the base of the brain called the pineal gland. And it was considered a possibility because nobody knew what the pineal gland did at the time. But the interaction was that, okay, there's a mind slash soul that is more eternal, and then there's a body that is mortal. And so science can study the body. Religion still gets control over what happens to the soul. That mind-body split has continued in many ways throughout our history ever since. So we're looking at 400 years later, and we still find ourselves engaging in a lot of ways in the mind-body split. So when I ask the question, is it physical or is it psychological? That question comes out of an assumption that there's a mind-body split. That question assumes that that really there's a physical part and then there's a mental part. We now are agreed upon that it's okay to study the mental part, and religion can still look at the more eternal soul, although we don't fully understand or even agree on what that means. But there's still that split. So we see in our medical system, we have traditional medicine, and then we have mental health. And mental health is typically cordoned off from and treated separately from physical health. In that sense, we often have people who say, that's not actually a physical problem, it's a psychological problem or a mental problem, and so the mind-body split still gets a lot of attention and is still kind of an assumption that underlies everything. What I'd like to propose to you today is that split is, that assumption that there's a split between the mind and body is much less likely to be an accurate assumption than we have considered it over the last 400 years. And in fact, some of the recent studies that we're going to talk about today will show that there's really a lot of overlap between the mind and the body, and that we need to stop thinking of them as somehow separate from each other. But really, that what we have to do is we have to understand them as they are both operative in all of our human experience. So, first of all, it's kind of important for us to understand that either or thinking is really actually an easy thing for us to fall into. So, even the framework of my initial question, is it physical or psychological? That's either or thinking. And we do that quite easily. We talk about day or night as if there's some kind of clear demarcation, and it's either day or night. But we know from our own experience, if we're paying attention, that as the night starts to shift into being affected by the sun as it's rising in the morning, there's a gradual change in light. And there isn't a specific moment that we could look at and say, we just switched from day to night, or from night to day. It's much more on a continuum. Many things that work that way. So one of the reasons that this is such an easy thing to do is because when we are in a situation in which we feel we are under stress, we flip into a way of thinking that is either or. So if suddenly, in the midst of my talk today, the door to this room flew open, and there was a bear that was coming charging through the door. Don't worry, that hasn't happened all week, so I don't expect it to happen during this talk either. One of the things that happens is that my mind immediately goes into either or thinking. And so either I can run away, get to the other door and get out of here, close that and keep the bear contained, or if I can't get away, then I have to fight. So we talk about flight or fight. There's lots of ways that being in a stressful situation creates a kind of a mindset that flips us quickly into either or thinking. And it's because if I'm being threatened for my life, more subtle thinking isn't that helpful. It doesn't matter if it's a grizzly bear or a brown bear or a black bear. It only matters that the bear wants to kill me. And now I don't need all of those other more subtle characteristics to know that I either have to run away or I have to fight. That makes it easy for us to flip into either or thinking. And it happens to us in a lot of different ways. So we find ourselves thinking, okay, either this person is a friend or they're a foe. Either this person is good or they're evil. Either this is a good deal or it's a bad deal. And most of the time, the world isn't actually that simple. Either or helps us to make a clear decision. And that clear decision helps us to be able to move forward. But it doesn't always help us to make the best decision. It helps us to make a quick and definitive decision. So one of the things that might happen, for example, is that somebody might come for treatment because they had a racing heartbeat and shortness of breath and some chest pain, and they went to the emergency room at the hospital. The emergency room physicians, doing what they need to do, immediately checked that person, found out that their heart rate seems to be able to come down, they're able to gain their breath again, they're now looking at starting to feel better. So the physician says, okay, we're going to run some tests, make sure your heart is okay. Those tests are run, they come back, everything is normal. The physician says, well, then if it wasn't a physical thing, it's probably a psychological thing, and we suggest that you talk with a therapist about that. Well, truth is that it's rarely that simple. Individuals who are having what we refer to in our field as a panic attack are having lots of different experiences during that time, some of which have to do with how they're thinking, what emotions are going on, also what physically is going on. So their heartbeat actually does elevate. They are actually finding it more difficult to breathe. They are having more chest pains. Those are not made up symptoms. Those are part of the experience of the mind-body interaction. And what we find is that there's actually often more subtle experiences than that even. So if we look very carefully at people who are having a panic attack, over half of them, not all of them, but over half of them have a medical condition we call mitral valve prolapse. What that is there's a little valve that separates the chambers of the heart, and we call that a mitral valve. And in some individuals, that valve doesn't quite fully close, and so there's a little bit of backwash when the blood is being pumped from one end to the other. the valve closes, but it doesn't close all the way, and there's just this little bit of backwash. Well, it turns out that that's a very subtle sensation. And that subtle sensation causes a person who's a little bit more on the observant side, a little bit more aware of their physical body, to notice that sensation. When they notice the sensation, they're likely to go, there's a little bit of a startle reaction. Well, this startle reaction causes a release of a stress hormone, typically adrenaline. That adrenaline release then confirms that there actually might be a problem, and within a few milliseconds, the person goes from feeling calm to feeling panicky because something might be wrong. And so there's a subtle interaction between the physical sensations and the psychological reaction that that individual is having. As that psychological reaction occurs, there's then again an influence that causes the physical sensations to increase. And there's a bidirectional. Both things influence each other. A physical sensation triggers a psychological reaction. The psychological reaction triggers more physical sensation. More physical sensation triggers more psychological reaction. And within a few, less than a quarter of a second, the person is in the middle of a panic attack. Now, that doesn't mean that it's psychological. It's clearly both. There are many things that are occurring that are occurring in which there are two things or more that are happening. So one of the challenges for us is to figure out how we can pay attention to this larger picture, which will help us to be able to manage our psychological and physical health in a better way, and to let go of the need to say it's either or. There are a few occasions where it might be an either or that would be appropriate, but most of the time it's both and. So the truth is that thoughts, it turns out, are not immaterial as Rene Descartes assumed. When you have a thought, there's a physical process that's occurring within the brain. Releases of chemicals, electrical charges that are moving from one part of the brain to another. There's a very physical basis to a thought. There's a very clear physical basis to emotions. We don't have an emotion as if it's an immaterial thing. If I'm sad, if I'm angry, if I'm anxious, all of those have physical representations in our bodies. Again, it isn't an either or, it's a both and. One of the things that means is that psychological treatment can often help medical treatment. I'm going to take an example. Let's suppose somebody comes in and they've had chronic pain. Not an uncommon occurrence for individuals in therapy to have pain symptoms that have gone back for a very long time. Part of the reason for that ending up also being a subject of psychiatric or psychological treatment is that when we're under physical pain, some of the ways that the neurochemistry in our body gets upset is that the physical pain actually increases the kinds of chemical reactions that are associated with depressed mood. Depressed mood makes us more susceptible to physical pain. And so again, we have this interaction that's occurring between the physical and the psychological. And if that isn't problematic enough, oftentimes what happens is that the source of the physical pain, in the case of our example, we're going to talk about somebody who has lower back pain, which is a pretty common thing. Over time, because the brain is registering that lower back pain, the area of the brain that registers that pain becomes sensitized, and it then becomes overactive, adding to the problem of whatever physical trouble there might be in the lower back, because the brain region that's associated with that physical pain is now also misfiring or overactive and becoming more sensitive than it was before. So part of the treatment for chronic pain might very well be to learn how to work with the psychological aspects of that pain, as well as the physical parts of that pain, if we were to separate it the way that our previous assumptions, and recognize that those two things begin to influence each other. And so as I learn to let myself recognize what this is, I can learn not to overreact to that pain. Oh, I know what it is. I know it's uncomfortable. I know that it hampers my movement. I also know, because I've been working with both medical and psychological practitioners, I know whether it's dangerous or not. I know what I need to do in order to lower that pain a little bit. And by not reacting as much, I might be able then to get that pain down on what we often call a pain scale. I might be able to get that pain down from an 8 down to a 6 or maybe even a 5, where it's more manageable. Not gone, but more manageable. So that there's a psychological, physical, medical component that works together rather than one in opposition to the other. So there might also be many times that we need to involve medical treatment as part of psychological treatment. A clear example of this, somebody comes in and they're having depressive symptoms. They're feeling down most of the days, they're fatigued, they can't get much energy going. They get the assessment, and it's clear that they meet the criteria for diagnosis of depression. What is also happening for this particular individual in our particular example, and there are many other kinds of things, is this particular individual also has a thyroid that isn't working very well. And when the thyroid issue is identified and treated, and the thyroid begins to function more normally, some of the symptoms of depression quickly start to alleviate. There's more energy, there's clearer thinking, the mood lifts a little bit, and so there's an interaction effect between different physical symptoms and different psychological symptoms that are interplay. So what I'd like to do is give you an example of a couple of things that help us to understand how powerful this is. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk about two studies that were done by a psychology professor, Elizabeth Langer. She's currently at Harvard. When she did these studies, she was working at Yale. But she did these couple of remarkable studies. So the first study that she did, she did with hotel cleaning staff. And so she worked with a hotel chain, and she went in and she had these interactions with the cleaning staff. And so she divided them into two equal random groups. The first group, she said, your work is really important. It helps the hotel to be successful. Please keep up the good work. Very encouraging, but really emphasizing the importance of their work. The second group, she added something. She said, "Did you realize that when you're doing your cleaning of a room, you're changing the sheets, you're wiping everything down, maybe you're flipping the mattress, you're actually getting as much exercise as you would if you went to the gym and worked out for 30 minutes. Now, that's true, but the first group wasn't reminded of that. The second group, the experimental group, was reminded of that. A month later, what they discovered was that the group that was reminded that this is exercise had actually lost a significant amount of weight compared to the group that was just reminded of how important their work was. And that wasn't because they were doing anything different. It was because they were reminded that the work that they do is actually exercise. And so that mindset change actually had an impact on their physical body in a way that when they didn't have the mindset change, it didn't have the same impact. So Dr. Langer then did a second study, which is even more remarkable. In this study, it was done in the early 2000s. She took a group of people who were in their 70s and 80s, and she asked them to be volunteers, and they were going to go on a retreat that was going to last for a couple of weeks. The retreat was that they were going to live their life as if they were 20 or 30 years of age. So as part of the retreat, first of all, they had access to all of their medical records before they started, but they went to a place where the retreat house was an older but well-kept retreat house that would have been available to them when they were 20 or 30 years of age. All electronics were taken from them. They were actually even driven to the place in a car that was a vintage car from that time. Television was black and white and only had the channels that they would have had during that time. Newspapers were newspapers from that time. Essentially what happened is that they lived for a couple of weeks as if they were living when they were 20 or 30 years of age, even though they were in their 70s or 80s. At the end of the retreat, they did a full checkup, and one of the things that they found, which was not terribly surprising, was that their heart rates had come down, their blood pressure was better, their cholesterol was better, which was an unexpected thing. It's more similar to what somebody who was 20 or 30 years of age might be expected to have. Their hearing had improved. Even their vision had improved during this time that they were pretending to be 20 or 30 instead of being 70 or 80. Without any other intervention, some of these physical attributes that we would consider to be just a normal part of aging had reversed because their mindset had changed. There's a great deal that we don't know yet about the interaction between mind and body. It does go both ways. So physical sensations can create psychological effects. And when you're working with a therapist or a psychiatrist, don't overlook the possibility that you might also need to be checked out by a medical practitioner to see what kind of physical sensations might be affecting your psychological state. It is also true that it goes the other way, that your psychological expectations, your psychological state will affect your physical functioning. And we're beginning to understand that these things are less separate than we thought they were. So this is background information. When you're working in treatment, whether you're talking about physical treatment or psychological treatment, this isn't stuff that you're likely to encounter too much in the treatment process itself. But as background information, understand that there's a lot of interaction between these things. And take care of yourself on both levels. Make sure that your physical and psychological health is equally respected and equally attended to as you're working to have your very best health. So if you like this, please make sure that you hit the like button, share it with friends, subscribe if you're so inclined, so that you can know about each of these talks as they come up. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the interaction now next week between physical exercise and our mood states, which again is another extension of all this. So thank you for your attention, and we'll be talking to you again next week. Thanks.